I have to be honest, it feels a little strange to be preaching on joy on a day like today. It feels strange because even in our own community, even in our own congregation, we know that we are on the precipice of grief. And it feels strange because we know that there are dozens, perhaps hundreds of families across the South, the Midwest, who are not on the precipice of grief. They're right in the middle of it. And yet, it is exactly at a time like this that we need joy the most. Now, today, we're going to kind of just lay the foundation for our thinking about joy. We're going to talk about these 4 questions. What is joy? Where does it come from? How does it benefit us? And of course, most importantly for our purposes, how did Christ make joy available to the world? And then, God be willing, over time, we're going to come back to some of these ideas again and again and again. Okay? And as time goes on, we're just going to build out some complication, some structure, some depth. But this morning, we're just going to begin with our foundation. We're going to start with the question, what is joy? Now, you'll hear a lot of preachers get in pulpits, some of them with pretty good academic credentials, who will give you these super spiritual definitions of joy. The problem is those definitions don't have any basis in solid linguistics. When you read through the Old Testament's various usage of the word joy, and believe me, you're going to be reading for a while because I'm still not done. What you find is that joy at its foundation can just be described as exuberance, as the emotion that motivates us to celebrate. You'll see here on the screen, I've got the picture from when Coach Jim Valvano and his North Carolina State basketball team won the national championship. I couldn't find the actual picture I was looking for. There's this wonderful video, I know, and I'm sure there's photographs out there somewhere, but I couldn't find them, where he's running around the court with his arms held out looking for somebody to hug. And it's such a beautiful picture of joy. Now, some of you, your minds are already running to some difficult texts in the New Testament. How do we have that kind of joy when it hurts so much? And that's okay. It's all right that your mind goes there. But we're going to have to come back to that question later. And I think some of the things that we talk about this morning will help us with that question. Okay? Right now, we just need to understand that joy is, from a biblical point of view, not even thinking about it sort of theologically or philosophically or psychologically. We'll come back to those sometime later too. But just from a biblical perspective, joy is this exuberance that motivates us to celebrate. Now, what are the sources of joy? Where do we get it? How do we get joy? Well, before we answer that question, we need to look at a couple of false answers. One of them comes from the world in which we live, and it says that joy comes from experiencing pleasure. In fact, the world will tell you that joy is pleasure. Now, as we will see in a moment, the relationship between joy and pleasure is kind of complex. But one thing we can say for sure is that just you experiencing pleasure is not joy, and it does not bring joy. Likewise, some people in the church will tell you, oh, well, you get joy by just thinking really hard about Jesus, by just concentrating really hard on the good things that you have in your life. Now, folks, I'm for gratitude. I'm for contemplation. We talked about the spiritual disciplines a couple of weeks ago. Those are really valuable and they're really helpful. But I'm here to tell you something that maybe some preachers won't tell you. You can't work your way to joy. You can't will your way to joy. That's not where it comes from. The problem with both of these sort of false answers is that they're focused on me. And that's not where joy comes from. So biblically speaking, where does joy come from? Well, the first source is a sense of well-being. Or really, more accurately, because the sense of well-being we'll talk about next week. That's a biblical word we call peace. But we'll talk about that next week. Joy is more the awareness that I have this well-being. It's that emotion that wells up in me when I go, this is good. This is really, really good. And that sense of well-being can be personal. It can be individual. We see that in the Psalms we read this morning. The psalmist uses that word, I, a lot. Because he's experiencing these things in a very personal way. But more often, joy comes when we have this relational sense of well-being. You're helping me and I'm helping you and we're building each other up and this is all good. It can even be collective. All of us together, we've made it. It reminds me of all of the great epic literature of our time, whether it be C.S. Lewis or J.R.R. Tolkien, or even the Harry Potter series, J.K. Rowling. Think about those books if you've read them. When you get to the end, there is just this sense where the characters all look at each other and go, I'll be doggone, we made it. We survived. And you feel that joy with them. That's what makes for great literature. It draws you into that emotion. Now, there's a second source, and it's closely related to the first. And we see it just kind of really alluded to in our Psalms, especially Psalm 45, but Psalm 16 as well. Joy comes when the good guys win. I don't know if you can see this. I have a Razorback tie on this morning. And I remember when the Arkansas Razorbacks won the national championship. It was a little bit more than a decade after North Carolina State. And I was so happy. And I wasn't half as happy as some of the people in my neighborhood. One of my friends ran out his front door when the final buzzer sounded and just started screaming his head off in his front yard. I'm sure the neighbors thought he had lost his mind. The good guys won. And at a superficial level, there's this sense of shared accomplishment. Think about the fans of any sports team. Most of them, they never touched a ball. They never drew up a play. They never even bought a single ticket. But there's this sense that I helped will my team to victory. We did it. How many times do you hear fans say that? We did it. But at a deeper level, this awareness that the good guys won is rooted in something so much deeper. Something that matters so much more. Imagine if you were an Israelite farmer. It's about 701 BC. And the Assyrians have come in, the Assyrian army has come, and they have destroyed people's crops. They have killed young men. They have raped young women. And all of a sudden, something amazing happens, and they're all gone. Now, granted, tomorrow, the next day, the next year, 5 years from now, you're going to feel the devastation of all the trauma that you've experienced. But for that one moment, and maybe for a while after that, what are you going to feel? You're going to feel elation because it's over. And these horrible, terrible things that have been happening aren't going to happen anymore. The right people are now in charge. And of course, that source of joy is related to this next source of joy. And we see it explicitly in Psalm 45. Joy comes when human life is remade, is refocused around three things. Did you see them? There in verse 4, verse 5, somewhere in that range. Truth, humility, and justice. Right? Now, two of those make a whole lot of sense, right? We live in an age dominated by falsehood. And to be frank, some of us are the ones perpetrating that falsehood. But we know that what we really need is an age dominated by truth, where we know what's real, where truth reigns. And we know that when truth reigns, so will justice. Not only will people no longer be deceived by lies, but people will no longer be oppressed by selfish and evil powers. But what about humility? That's an odd thing. Remember, this Psalm 45, if you look there at the title, it's a wedding song originally for a Jewish king. Ancient Near Eastern kings weren't supposed to be humble. So why is humility such an important part of joy? Why must humility permeate not just our leaders, but our whole society? Because Without humility, nobody is safe. Pride leads to despotism. Humility allows everybody to live free. And there's a final source here, and it's you really see it there at the end of Psalm 16. Psalm 16:11, verses 10 and 11, really, but especially verse 11, is just so beautiful. Because while pleasure does not bring joy, shared pleasure does. I remember Natalia and I not been married very long. And she graduated with her master's degree on the same weekend that I graduated with my doctorate. And my parents came down, of course. And my parents come down quite a bit, maybe once a year. They used to come down more like twice a year. Natalia has lived in Dallas-Fort Worth for 25 years, and her parents have probably only visited here 3 or 4 times. It's a longer drive for them. And my parents like to travel. Her parents are not like that. And this was the first and only time that her parents came to see us. And once the graduations were done, we got to take both of our parents out to one of our favorite barbecue places. And I found out that night they make a darn good steak too. Now, I like barbecue as much as anybody who's ever lived. And I like to eat barbecue as much as anybody who's ever lived. I'd be healthier if I didn't. Yeah. But the fun of eating some ribs was nothing compared to the joy of sharing that moment with my parents and my in-laws. Everything, including the food, was infused with just this special significance because we were doing it together. Notice there at the end of Psalm 16, the word joy is never mentioned until the psalmist considers what it will be like to be in the very presence of God. That's when he will experience joy. That's when he will receive those pleasures from God's hand. Those are the sources. Those are the real sources of pleasure. If you dug through the Old Testament, you might find 1 or 2 more, but those are 4 really good ones. Okay? Now, real quickly, let's talk about how does joy benefit us? Then we're going to come back to the real question. Right? So keep those 4 sources of joy in your mind, because we'll come back to them here in just a second. How does joy benefit us? Well, again, we're focusing on the Bible. There's other things that we can talk about. We're focusing on the Bible, and in the Bible, what you find, if you, maybe not so much in our Psalms, but if you call through the whole scad of joy references in the Old Testament, what you find is that joy binds us together. When we experience shared joy, it binds us together emotionally. It helps us to experience real community. That's the benefit. But now that I've said that, I want to expand our minds just a little bit. I want you to do a thought experiment with me. Okay? What would happen? How would things be different? What would it mean if our Christian psychologists are right? Following the work of a psychologist out in California, out at UCLA, named Alan Shore, several Christian psychologists and psychiatrists are beginning to argue that the human brain has two motivation systems, fear and joy. But they are also beginning to argue, as they read Scripture together, that joy is the system that our minds are mostly designed to run on. What if they're right? What if our brains were designed to run on joy? And what if we lived in a world where that really happened? How would that world be different? How would we be different? It's an important question. It's a relevant question. Because you see, what we're really here to talk about is how did Jesus bring joy, make joy available to the world? Because our fundamental conviction as Christians, whether we are Second Baptist Church of Ranger, or whether we are the Orthodox Church of Athens, Greece, is that Christ brought joy. How did he do that? Well, let's use our four sources of joy. We're going to slightly reorder them, okay? But we're going to see how Jesus did this. By the way, why did we read Psalm 16 and Psalm 45 today? Because in each one of those texts, there is a messianic passage, one that the early church thought was so important, they incorporated it into their writings. It became an indispensable part of how they understood Jesus. And the first thing that we can say is that Jesus brought victory. Jesus won victory. Well, what did he win victory over? Well, he won victory over sin. Sin isn't just the bad stuff that we do, it's that. But it's also the way that that bad stuff is imbued with power by the forces of evil to enslave us. Not to God, but to evil. To those very things that will destroy us. And Jesus won the victory over sin. Jesus won victory over shame. From the very first humans, sin brought shame. Shame is that thing that separates us from one another and from God. It's that thing that says to you, you're not good enough. And God doesn't want you. Neither does anybody else. And of course, sin and shame are mutually reinforcing. The more shame we experience, the more that a lot of times we just turn to sin to comfort ourselves. And the more sin that we experience, the more sin that we commit, the more that it enslaves us, and the more that it shames us, the more that it separates us from God and from each other. And what's the ultimate result of that process? Death. But Jesus won the victory over shame through the cross by taking that shame upon himself, and he won the victory over death. And not just death, but its handmaids too. You see, so much of our lives are dominated by suffering, by injustice, by deprivation. And those experiences are imbued with particular power because they are the handmaids of death. But Jesus won the victory. He walked out of that grave and he put sin and shame and death on public display through the cross. It's the ultimate example of the good guys winning. The one, only true good guy really did win. And he won over the things, the enemies, the hardships that really, really matter. It's interesting. Jesus didn't just do that in the past. He keeps doing things that bring us joy. He keeps sharing with us his very own presence. Right? And what does that presence do? It reminds us that we're okay. And that we're going to be okay. Granted, we still experience death. We still experience suffering. We still experience injustice and poverty and all sorts of negative things. Christ told us that's how it would be, right? And yet, his very presence through the Holy Spirit is there telling us, you're all right. You're okay. This doesn't change who you are to me, or who you are to the Father. That's what we've been talking about the last several Sundays when we talk about the Spirit in Galatians and what it does. Paul's even more clear about it in Ephesians. The Spirit of Jesus walks with us through these experiences, through these hardships. So, Christ brings victory. Christ reminds us that we're okay, that we have this sense of shared well-being. And he gives us the context and the rationale for the experience of shared pleasure. No, we don't have to use sin to medicate our pain anymore. We're set free from that. In fact, Christ has done something really remarkable. He has reordered, our lives around new ways of thinking, new ways of being. Yes. Truth, humility, and justice. Yes. But more importantly, love. That's what we talked about last week. And because of that, because he has changed our lives in this way, he's given us a new framework, a new context, a new way of building relationships with one another and of building a relationship with God. And in that relationship is joy. Too many times, I think Christians have been thought of as the fun police. And some Christians kind of see themselves that way. If it's fun, it must be sin. But that's not Jesus. No. Jesus isn't anti-fun. Maybe I should be even a little more provocative. Jesus isn't anti-sex. He isn't anti-food. He isn't anti-exercise. He isn't anti-art or music. But he is our Creator. And he wants us to experience all things in a framework that is dominated by love, that is shaped by truth, humility, and justice. So yes, there will be some things he tells us. You're not supposed to do that. That's not good. But he's saying it because it's not good for us and because we'll use it to hurt each other. And in so doing, he establishes a foundation for the experience of genuine joy. The coming of Jesus into our world is a joyous occasion. And as we contemplate it, as we celebrate it, it is an opportunity for us to experience joy today. Let's lean into our relationship with Jesus and our relationships with one another. Let's ask God to help us experience joy and to be conduits of joy for one another.